I know some of you, but probably not all of you. My name's Charlotte Benson, and I'm an oncologist working at the Royal Marsden. And I've been looking after patients with GIST since year 2000. I was very lucky when I was in training to be taken under the wing of my mentor, Professor Ian Judson, who I think some of you know. And we were very lucky at the beginning of this century, now that makes me feel old, in 2000 to start treating some of the very first patients with a new drug called STI-571, which is now known as imatinib or Gleevec. And we really saw how this new drug completely transformed the lives of patients with GIST. And I think GIST has always been at the forefront of clinical trials and new developments. So what I wanted to talk to you about today was about some of the forthcoming trials which you might be interested to hear about. At the end of my talk, I've got a couple of slides from Ramesh Balusu, particularly talking about some trials for patients with wild-type GIST. And then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions. I'm happy to take questions at the end of our talk. So first of all, just to start off, this patient was called patient 0. This was the very first patient to be treated with imatinib or STI-571, and that was back in 2000. And this was completely revolutionary and was reported in the New England Journal of Medicine. I don't know if I've got a pointer, but so this is a PET scan of a patient with metastatic GIST. And all the areas, the dark areas you can see are areas of active disease. And within 4 weeks, which is the second picture, you can see that those areas of disease completely switched off by imatinib. So that was an amazing revolution at the time. So I think there's been a lot of changes since in the management of GIST since 2000. We now know that a one-size-fits-all approach is not necessarily the right way, and we understand a lot more about the molecular basis of GIST, so about differences between patients. So we now try and stratify or alter our treatment according to what we know about the patient's characteristic and also about mutations in their genes. One of the most important things is pathology review, and I know that that's been something that's really been driven by GIST Support UK, because it's really important with your GIST that it's looked at by a specialist GIST pathologist who knows how to do molecular analysis, because that really makes a difference about how we treat each patient. Thanks, Jane. So I'm just going to talk briefly about some trials that are going to be open or have opened in the UK. But before I talk about the specific trials, I just wanted to explain at the beginning that there's really two main groups of patients for the clinical trials. So the first group, is the microphone working okay? Yeah. Everyone can. The first group is early stage disease. So these are patients who've had a GIST removed by surgery and don't have any other evidence of GIST elsewhere. So they might have a GIST from the stomach, most commonly, could be the small bowel, sometimes other parts of the body. So that's one group of patients that we might consider for trial. The second group is patients with what we call metastatic disease. So this is just a picture I got from Google Images. So it shows a picture of a patient with, that's the stomach here. There's a gastric GIST. These are some metastatic deposits close to the liver or in the peritoneum. So that's the second group of patients that we might think about with trials. Next slide. So the first group, the patients with early stage disease, we call this treatment adjuvant treatment. So it means treatment that builds on surgery, because we know that although surgery is the primary treatment and the most curative treatment for people with early stage disease, there is a risk of recurrence. And we know that the risk of recurrence is related to the size of the tumour, how active the tumour looks under the microscope, and also where the GIST has come from. So a GIST from the stomach has a different risk level than a GIST from the bowel. So there's been a number of trials which have shown that adjuvant imatinib, which means imatinib after surgery, can improve overall survival for people with high-risk GIST. And that was on the basis of two big trials. First, we showed that 1 year was better than no treatment. And then secondly, a second trial showed that 3 years of imatinib was more effective than 1. So now we're wondering, maybe we can do better than 3 years. So we've got a big trial. It's being run by the Scandinavians, but it's also open here in the UK, which which is now looking at whether 5 years could be possibly better than 3 years. So this is what's called a randomized trial, because it's the only way for us really to prove whether a treatment is better. So patients are randomly allocated into 2 groups, either to stop adjuvant imatinib at 3 years, or whether to carry on the imatinib for 5 years. So this trial is open for patients who are currently on adjuvant imatinib. We're running it at the Marsden. Ramesh Balusu, who many of you know, he is the UK PI of the trial. It's open in Cambridge, Manchester, all the main UK sites. So that's something for patients to think about. Just coming on to now advances in metastatic disease. What happened to my slide there? So currently, for metastatic disease, there's 3 main treatments that we use: imatinib, sunitinib, and regorafenib. Jane, if you just keep pressing. And we keep press. That's it. Keep going. That's lovely. And one more press. So we now know that there's opportunities to take part in trials all through the treatment pathway. So either after imatinib treatment, after sunitinib treatment, and beyond regorafenib treatment. And if we go to the next slide. So, so these are some of the trials I'm just going to talk about today. They all have really confusing names and don't sound like they mean very much. Just to say, the first thing is when you see EORTC, that stands for, that's the European sort of collaborative group. Because GISTs are so rare, we don't have many trials that are just run in the UK. They're usually run in collaboration, often with Europe, or more often worldwide, so that we can really pool together patients from all around the world. So the EORTC organises a number of trials. So I'll come on to talk to the next one. So this trial is an interesting trial which is actually just closed, but it's being run by the EORTC. And I see that in the questions that Jane submitted to me about from patients, one of the questions people ask is, why does imatinib stop being effective after a period of time for patients with metastatic GIST? And the first thing to say is for some patients, they can remain on imatinib, it seems to be indefinitely, and it continues to help. But in other people, you can develop what's called resistance mutations. So your GIST starts becoming resistant to the imatinib. And we don't really know, well, we know that there's these mutations. That's why the imatinib is not so effective. So the purpose of this trial was try to see if, instead of having imatinib up front, whether it would be better to alternate between 1 month imatinib, 1 month regorafenib, and trying to sort of trick the GIST into so it doesn't get too used to either treatment. So this is called the ALT-GIST study, and that's just completed recruitment. And we did have some patients from a patient from the Marsden taking part in this study. And the main aim of this trial was whether it was delaying time to development of resistance in patients with GIST. So I think we'll await that one with great interest. So these next set of slides, these are they're quite busy slides. Robin Jones kindly gave these to me to present today, and I'll talk you through them, so please don't be off-put because they look extremely wordy. So this is a trial that we're running at the Royal Marsden, and it's called Blue GIST, and it's a new treatment for patients with relapsed GIST, and it looks like a very exciting treatment, especially for people with a very rare type of GIST. We know from the mutation of the GIST what's the likelihood of response to imatinib. And some patients have a mutation that means that they're resistant to imatinib from the outset. And that's called a D842V mutation. And up to now, we haven't had very effective treatments for this mutation, but things seem to be being transformed by this new drug. Next slide. So this is a company slide, and really it's showing us what's the effect of this new drug, Blue 285. And what this graph is showing you is how much drug is needed to inhibit cancer GIST cells under the microscope. And this is all the different types of GIST. So here's wild-type GIST. The rare D842V mutation is here. And if you can see for the D842V one, look how much imatinib, that's the green bar, is needed to stop the cells from growing. It's a lot of imatinib. But the blue GIST drug, you only need a relatively small concentration. So it already looks like a very effective drug in the lab. And it also seems to be effective with people with other mutations as well. So not only patients with this rare mutation. So they've already conducted a trial where in the US looking at patients with different types of GIST. Next slide. And what this shows is, this is what's called a waterfall plot. And anything that falls below the line shows that there's been tumour shrinkage. Anything above the line shows that the tumour has grown. And you can see, and each bar represents a single patient. And you can see in the early part of the trial that the majority of patients have had some shrinkage from the treatment. Next slide. But the patients with the very rare D842V mutation, all of them got a response. So that's really, really exciting. Next slide. So we've had some patients at the Marsden. So this is open at the Marsden, and we're taking patients from all around the country because it's a very small number of patients with this mutation. I just wanted to show you a CT scan. So this is a picture of a patient with GIST, and it's like a slice through their tummy. I'm sorry, I'm not very tall back. all this grey area here, that's all tumour. That's before they started the treatment. And you can see now the reduction in size of the tumour. So the patient had a very uncomfortable tummy full of GIST, and by the end of a year, hardly any disease left. And actually that was able to be removed surgically. So that's been an amazing response. So it seems like the most impressive responses are people with this rare mutation, but it also seems to be helpful with other people with other mutations too. So I think watch this space. And I think this drug has actually now got a name, but I read it last night and I can't remember it. But they always are very long and unpronounceable. It does begin with A, and it ends in nib. Make up your... I did read it and I thought I must remember that for tomorrow, then it's just gone out of my head, so apologies. Okay, next slide. So that's the blue GIST study. So that's an interesting study, and we'll be hearing a lot more about that drug. The next study is an EORTC study. So this is another European study, and it's a study for patients with GIST who've already had imatinib and sunitinib. So it's a drug called Cabozantinib. Next slide, please, Jane. So Cabozantinib is a tyrosine kinase inhibitor, and a bit like sunitinib and regorafenib, it doesn't hit just one target, it hits a lot of targets. And actually you need that for patients who are developing GIST that is resistant to imatinib. It's already used for treatment of thyroid cancer in the EU and the States, so we know that it's an effective drug in other tumour types. And they saw some evidence of activity in the lab, and also in some patients in an early trial in Japan. Next slide. Oh, avapritinib, that was the name, thank you. So this study is open in the UK. I'm the UK PI for this study. It's open at a number of sites. So it's for patients who've progressed on sunitinib.
Sorry, is the blue trial still open?
The blue, yes, but the blue GIST trial is it's a worldwide study, so the slots are competitive. So what happens is that there's a teleconference every week, and there are slots, but they come up one by one. So
Sorry to interrupt you.
that's okay.
I know another patient that
Yes.
was offered blue one and this one.
Yes.
And he was told blue just
Yes. So that's right. So that trial, the blue GIST, is a phase 1 trial. So they are getting towards the end of accrual. They're still recruiting for people with a very rare mutation, the D842V. I think slots for people with other types of GIST are coming to an end now. Okay, that's okay. So this is an EORTC study, and it's trying to look at whether cabozantinib might give another line of treatment for people with metastatic GIST. So we've got this trial open at the Marsden. It's also open at Clatterbridge, which is in Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham. And we've already got a number of patients on study. In terms of side effects, because that's very important for patients, and I know you're going to be talking about side effect management later, it seems to be similar to sunitinib and regorafenib. So you're still getting those problems, mostly with sort of hand-foot discomfort, some diarrhea, and can cause blood pressure, high blood pressure. But we've seen some early results which look quite promising, which is very good. This trial is likely to be open for a while. So I'll be going to the EORTC meeting in Paris in April, when everyone will be updating us about how this trial is going. So that's currently open at the moment. And this is another one which hasn't yet got a name. So this is a drug made by a company called Decifera. And this is an interesting drug because it says, you can see it says PAN, KIT, and PDGFRA. So it's actually inhibiting both KIT mutations, which are the common ones, but also PDGFR alpha. Next slide. And this was in phase 1, and these are some of the results from the phase 1 trial, which were presented, I think, at ASCO last year. Next slide. And this has been used in patients with GIST, but also with a rare type of brain tumor, which has a similar sort of mutation. So we don't need to worry about the brain scans here, because it doesn't really apply to us. But here's quite a nice picture of a patient being treated with this drug, Decifera. You can see, if you can see the red line across, that's the tumor on baseline. You can see a very good shrinkage. And that's what we call a partial response, so a significant shrinkage with this drug in a patient with an exon 11 mutation. And so this was thought to be very promising and exciting, and seems to have activity in a number of different types of GIST. Doesn't seem to matter what subtype. So now this was the early phase trial. So when you've done a phase 1 trial, you're trying to look at side effects and hints of activity. And then you need to move on to a bigger phase 3 trial, which is currently open. Now this trial is filling up very, very fast. So one of the problems we have in the UK is often these trials originate from America. The Americans recruit very, very quickly to the study because they have a big pool of patients. In the UK, we have a lot of regulatory hurdles, and we have to go through a lot to get these trials open. And then when we open them, we're told there's very few slots left, which is difficult, but that's what we have to deal with. So we've got this trial open at the Marsden, but the slots are very competitive again. So I think we've been promised a small number, but I think this drug is looking very exciting. And if the phase 3 trial is positive, then hopefully it might provide some hope for another potential line of treatment for patients with GIST. And just to conclude my talk, these are some slides from my colleague Ramesh Balusu, who many of you know. So Ramesh is an oncologist in Cambridge, and he has a particular interest in PAWS or wild type and pediatric and wild type GIST. And he wanted to update you about what trials there were specifically for patients with wild type. And I think it's important to say with the other trials that we discussed, generally we would consider all types of mutation, but with wild type it's a different type of GIST, and I think there's some interesting lines that are being investigated in the US. And Jane tells me that Ramesh has been having a lot of teleconferences trying to make sure that these trials could be open in the UK. Next. The first trial is a trial that's currently open in the US, which is particularly for patients with wild type GIST, and it's a DNA methyltransferase inhibitor, in particular for people with what's called SDH deficiency, which is quite a large number of people with wild type GIST. And I think this one's open and running in the States. Jane, is this the one that you said that's been quite slow to recruit? I think we already, as we said, we know GIST is a rare disease, and then when we start subdividing it into smaller and smaller groups, the patient pool gets smaller and smaller. So often these trials are open for a while. Next slide. And then the second one is an interesting one, which is a MEK inhibitor. So we know that neurofibromatosis type 1, that's a gene, can be mutated in people with wild type GIST. And this drug particularly goes for people with this specific mutation. So some of you may well have been, if you're in the wild type GIST community, may well have been to Ramesh's excellent clinic in Cambridge. And when you're seen there, his pathologist ran a full panel looking at all the mutations. And then the idea is that if we can identify particular mutations, then we can really use very specific drugs to see if we can help gain some response and improvement in quality of life for patients. And this is just my final slide, just to say, obviously I'm an oncologist, so I like talking about drug treatments. I'm sorry Mr. Mudan's not here this afternoon to talk to you about surgery, but I think it's also important to say that we always manage GIST as a multidisciplinary team. So it's not just about the drug treatment. There's also a role for surgery. We do think about something called radiofrequency ablation, which some of you may know about, which is sometimes helpful if there's small areas of disease in the liver that need treating. There's something called embolization, which is trying to block blood vessels that are supplying the tumour, and also radiotherapy. So it's, I think the most important take-home message today is that no two GIST patients are the same, different mutations, different patterns of spread. So we all have to really work together and get our heads together to find an individual treatment plan for each patient. I think that's what makes it such an interesting and rewarding disease to treat. And I think we're working really hard to try and find new treatments for everybody. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but that's the end of my talk. And I'm very happy to take questions if people have questions they'd like to ask me.
Don't all shout at once. I'm sure there's some questions. Here we go. We've got a microphone which Judith will give to you so that everybody can hear your question as well. So if you put your hand up, we'll get a microphone to you first.
Thank you. Is this working? Yes. Yeah. Two questions. The first is a more general question, which is that since GIST patients are fairly rare, do these international trials involve cooperation with the most populous countries like India and China? And secondly, you mentioned that entering these trials is competitive. What are the criteria? Is it prior treatment and pathology, or is there something else?
That's a really good question. So the first question was about participation of patients around the world. So most of these treatments, as I've outlined, are in collaborative groups. So we've got our European collaborative group, and then also worldwide groups. So the Adjuvant trial, the Scandinavian GIST one, is Europe, US, and Australia. You make a very good point about involvement of patients in other countries. I think that's something that needs a lot of work, and I think it's also about, in India, for instance, we had an oncologist visit us, and India is very difficult because they haven't got obviously got a national health system. India are very good at making their own generic drugs, and so often that's what they will do. But it's very patchy, so I think we really would like to include patients from all around the world. An interesting fact is that actually different patient populations often have different abilities to metabolize drug. So for instance, in lung cancer is quite prevalent in Southeast Asia and Japan, but sometimes patients from those populations tolerate drugs with different side effects because of underlying genetic differences. So that gives us another challenge. The second question, yes, we have very strict what we call inclusion and exclusion criteria for trials, which I think is very frustrating, I know, for patients, because you feel like you're trying to fit in a box. I think from a scientific point of view, we want to try and make sure that populations are as similar as possible, so that if we're comparing treatment A versus treatment B, we can be sure that it's not due to variation in patient, but it's actually the drug that's having the effect. With these multi-center trials, the way it actually works in practice is that, for instance, the Blue GIST trial, we have a teleconference once a week with all our colleagues all around the world, and everyone says, I've got a patient, and there's a bit of, well, you had the last one, so, so there's a bit of that as well. Does that answer your second question? Yeah. Thank you.
Going to make you work for your role today, Judith. Right at the back, and then one at the front.
Hello, hope you're well. Quick question about blue. I'd heard that it wasn't suitable for wild-type GIST. Is that right?
I think now with the Blue GIST trial, they're very much focusing on recruitment for patients with that rare D842V mutation. They did have other slots for all comers, and I don't think there was an exclusion for wild type per se, but I think now they're actually just trying to recruit the D842V mutation. I think watch this space, that's changing quite quickly. And I think the next step, because that's what we call a phase 1 trial, so identifying what's the right dose and what the side effects, the next step will be a bigger study now that we've shown some activity. So hopefully that means that there will be slots again, not with this specific trial, but it will be leading to a second trial to find out.